So it's time to make everything start looking a little bit nicer. And the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly go through and fix up our lighting setup and our fog and everything like that. That's kind of legacy from when we first started the project. So I'm going to go to my world outliner and I'm going to just delete my atmospheric fog. Now that I've done that, the next thing I'm going to do is click in the background and just delete these clouds. For my directional light, I'm going to click on this and I'm going to start configuring this in a way that it's actually going to be not casting as strong of a shadow, but rather something that's a little bit more kind of, not quite straight down, but only a little bit of a shadow getting cast onto the playfield. Now it's a good idea at times like this, I'm going to hit play, and then I'm going to hit stop, and then after I've clicked on the screen, I'm going to hit Control 1. And the reason for that is that actually bookmarks where the camera currently is. So if I was over here checking this out, looking at that, and then I hit 1, I can always just see what it's going to look like from a play perspective. So now that I've added that in, let's have a look at some other things that I need to do. Well, first off, I'd really like to be able to see this area a little bit better. So I'm going to start tinkering with this camera and putting it into a position that I think is going to be just a little bit nicer for play. So I'm going to move it up top, and I'm going to tilt it down just a little bit. And the other thing I'm going to do here is when I grab here and I pull it back, initially I'm going to pull it back a little bit too far. But you can see here that we have field of view, and if I change this, doing this and pulling it down this way actually kind of changes the lens a little bit. And more importantly, by dropping this to about 80 degrees or so, it actually makes this entire world closer to being an orthographic camera, so it makes it closer to being like a more flattened out perspective. When I hit play now, you can see that the camera ending up in this position has made this channel far more visible, and I can still see the rest of the world reasonably well. So you can see my settings over here if you want to use them, but I think that's probably a good move. It's also a good idea here to bookmark the new camera position, so I'm going to hit Control 1 again. And don't be afraid of changing this around. You can leave different Control 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 for different perspectives. For instance, if I was going to have the menu in the game over here, I could hit Control 2, and then I would have 1 and 2. And I could switch between those positions as I'm mapping and modifying and changing things. So with that in mind, we've got a rather simple setup for a camera. Let's actually go through and start setting up everything else. Now the first thing I'm going to do is add a frame around the table, just something to make it look a little bit more like an actual pinball table. I'm going to go to my pinball assets, and I'm going to import the asset down at the very bottom called table frame. I'm just going to drag that straight in, and I'm just going to click import. For this asset actually, I'm also going to disable collision because it's purely there for aesthetic reasons. And you'll notice that we now have a simple frame. So I'm going to drop this into the world, zero out its x-axis. It's a good idea to change your snap grid at this point. I'm just going to zero out all of the axes actually. So now that we've got that in, I'm now just going to scale it across and then start positioning it just so it's a little bit nicer with where it sits. It's a good idea to go into unlit mode if you're trying to get it scaled up correctly. Alternatively, I can click here. I can go to my top-down camera, and I can see whether or not it's fitting the frame. At the moment, I can see pretty clearly that it's not, so I'm going to tinker with that first and go 1.4. Oops, these were scaled in the process. So 1.4 seems like it'll work. We kind of want this to be sitting... We want this to be sitting here, but this to be here. So 1.4 is a little big. 1.45. That seems pretty good. And now for the y-axis, I'm going to change that to be just a little bit lower. I'm going to try 0.9 initially. 0.925 seems pretty good for my setup. This is going to change depending on who's doing it. So I'm not too concerned. And when I go back to it here, I go back into lit mode. Hitting play, that gives me this. Now I can see it's probably a good idea for me to change my directional light around as well. And another option that I have here is getting the camera. Now, if I want to pull the camera directly back, a nice technique is to click here and switch it into local space, at which point I can actually just pull it directly back, which I just did then. And that does look a little bit nicer. So I'm now going to fix up my lighting. I'm going to turn this back into world space. I'm just going to give it a little less. There you go, that looks quite nice. Another potentially good idea here is to add in a light source for general skylight. Now initially the light source isn't actually going to capture much and it's not going to look right, and that's because it's trying to capture the scene around you to create ambient light. Because we don't actually have one, my suggestion is to switch it from being captured scene over to being a cube map that's been just pre-captured. And once I do that, I'm just going to select a cube map that I think will work. My gut says that sunset could work, alternatively epic quad panorama. Gives you just a little bit of ambient lighting kind of bouncing around. I'm also going to turn it down just a little bit from being 1, so that's the difference between them. I'm going to push it down to about 0.25, just so it's bright, 0.3, so it's brightening things up, but not by too much. So we now got this. So that's starting to work. And at this point, I think it's a good idea for me to also start considering how I'm handling the brightness of the scene, because this is not actually going to really require any post-processing beyond like some bloom. I'm going to go ahead and drop in a post-process volume, and I'm just going to move it across to the side so it's easy to find. I'm going to tell it to be unbound, which means you don't have to be inside of the volume for it to take effect. And then I'm going to go down, and the first thing I'm just going to disable straight up is going to be the eye adaptation, which is auto exposure. So I'm going to go to that, and I'm just going to tell it the low percent and high percent. You can see the values that are set up here. Now, the way that you can kind of turn off exposure by default is if I set the min and the max brightness to be the same thing, it now won't adjust. If those are equal to one another, it completely turns off the feature. So that's actually good for us because it means I can use that to balance everything else out. In this case, I can see that, yes, I did put in the skylight before, but when I turned it down, I was turning it down as a way of compensating for the adaptation that was going on. So I'm going to turn that back up to 1, and we've got this. A little bit nicer. Going to make sure that this is all good, and see that I'm not particularly good at pinball. There we go. So this all works, everything's fine. I can see that my multipliers are still good, so we've got a score that's racking up, and I've got an environment that's starting to look a little bit nicer, but let's actually get this going another step forward. So the next thing I want to do is have an environment along here that kind of looks a bit more like a glossy wood. And a good way for me to do that is to go back to my assets, and I'm going to import the texture that we use called fibers, which is just t_fibers. So I'm going to drag that in. Now the fibers texture looks like this. Oops, just loading up. But we're going to use this to make ourselves a basic wood material that we can use as a way of having like a nice backboard. So it's a little ugly now, but it'll be good in just a moment. I'm going to right click and create a new material that's just going to be called m_tabletop. Capitalize the T. And within this, I'm now going to start setting things up. So the first thing that we need is a color. So this is going to be, I'm going to hit V, and I'm going to make a parameter called table color. And this is going to be, I think a deep red would be nice. I'm going to get rid of the green values from this to kind of make that kind of deep red. So 0.2600, that's what we have. Now if I was to just plug this into my base color, hit apply, save, we would have ourselves a very basic table color that we could use. And, you know, that's actually kind of a nice color to have. So I can look at that and see that it works in kind of an interesting way with the yellows. But let's go a little bit further. So let's go ahead and actually add those fibers in to make it look a little bit more interesting. I'm going to add a texture. I'm going to type in fibers. Now that we've got the color and the first fiber texture in, I'm going to basically add in a thing that says I want 10% of the fiber to be added to the table color. And a nice way to do that is with a lerp. So if I connect this with this, we would end up with a blend between the two. So you'll see it on the left hand side as I go. Now that's initially going to be white. But what I actually want to do here is I want to set the value of the fibers being kind of blended into it as if they were also colorful. So instead of lerping this against this, I'm going to multiply the color against the fibers first off and connect those two. So you can now see that it's a bit more like that. And now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get the alpha, and if this was equal to 0, it would be all that. If this value is equal to 1, it would be all that. Instead, I'm going to set this to be about an 0.1, so there's just a little bit of the fibers coming through. And I'm going to convert this to a parameter, just so we can change it later if need be. I'm going to call this fiber blend. Now the other thing that I want to do is I want to make this look not just up and down the grain, because if I hit apply and save and I look at this, what we have right now is that, which is just running up and down, which looks okay, but it's not the final result that I really want. So I'm going to get this, I'm going to duplicate it, and this time what I'm going to do is I want to have this going sideways, not just up and down. Now the common thought here is to rotate, add a rotator and move it around that way. But there's a nice function that if I hold down U and left click, this gives me my X and my Y coordinates that are going to be going onto this image. And I can use a function called swizzle, which lets me swap the X axis with the Y axis. And if you think about what that does, it actually makes the image go sideways instead. So I'm going to multiply these two against one another. And I'm just going to increase this blend initially so you can see it a bit better. You can now see that we end up with this kind of pattern going on instead. So I'm going to set this up to be 0.25, it's looking a little nicer. Save. And that's a bit nicer for me. The other thing that I think I kind of want to have going is I want to control how big these are. At the moment these are very small little lines, but I wouldn't mind them just being a bit bigger. Now I could just get this and plug it into, I could just increase the coordinate size here. But it's always a good idea to parameterize stuff like this. So what I mean by that is if we multiply the texture coordinate size against a number, we can actually change the scale of that number. So if I get this number and I plug this into a multiply, when I get this, if I multiply it against the number 5, for instance, you can see it's, I'm going to make this a bit clearer by just changing this up to 1 again. If I multiply it against the number 5, it'll be here. 1 is here. 0.2 is here. So you can see that a smaller number makes it a larger texture. So I'm going to go, for the time being, 0.25 we'll try out. And I'm going to set this blend back to 0.25. Which looks a little bit nicer to me. We've now got like a nice red wood that we can use. If I wanted to as well, I could use the fiber to change how this is reacting for the roughness values. But to be honest, the base roughness actually looks quite good, I think, for the table. So we've got that going. I'm now going to go through and set the rest of this up. I am going to quickly just match the colors between everything by going to my assets. I'm going to drag in this tabletop material onto all of the floors so it's consistent. Now if I look at these, it might be hard to see, but they don't entirely align. If I control click on all of these and then I go to alignment, align surface planar, it actually puts all of them so that they're perfectly aligned with one another. I missed a surface just then, so that was a good trick. But if I click alignment, align planar, they actually now all match one another so that they all blend in correctly and there's no seam, which is a nice little technique. So I've added this initially. Next up, we're going to look at how to add some decals so that I can start just adding in some cool symbols and stuff along the board. What I'd advise for the time being is spend some time just dropping in some materials so that you can kind of set up the board in whatever way you see fit so that we've got some color in there for the actual frame. I'm just going to go through and do that myself, but for the next session, we'll meet up and start doing decals.